Leslie, we have been excited about today. So thanks
Same.
for joining us. I remember when you talked to people at YML and few hundred people joined, your talk around design and brand and empathy, with consumers. And one of the things I rely on with my team is who should be our next guest. And they were like, let's bring on Leslie. And that since then, wanted to get you on. So I'm so glad that we are able to make it happen.
Well, mutual. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. So before we jump into, I think, your background, one thing which is so fascinating is I understand that when you were a child, you and your brother were essentially like literally worshipped Ronald Reagan. And so much so that you wrote a letter, to him and actually got a response out of the White House.
Yeah, I'm not going to say Ronnie was the author of the response. Yeah, this is one of my, how you have these like defining stories. It turned out like many other children of the early 80s, we were Ronnie passionates. And 6-year-old me and 9-year-old my brother decided to write him some fan mail. Probably heavily encouraging his trickle-down theories. I'm not sure what the notes actually contained, but a couple weeks later, we get back, each of us, a separate thank you note with a gift. And my brother's gift was a book about presidents, and my gift was a book about first ladies. And I just remember I was more confused than angry. But, I'd been like many people, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be the president. And it had never occurred to me that the world would consider that my aspirations should pivot towards something that actually I couldn't directly control. And I look back, I think that would not happen today. I don't think that would be the tale of fan mail from a mixed gender group of siblings. But I think for me, it always has sat as one of those iconic moments of the importance of representation and the transformation that the world is undergoing in terms of inclusive leadership.
Absolutely. I truly believe that world has changed in a very good way. Obviously, a lot of work still needs to be done since you have received that letter, from the White House, for sure. So let's jump into your background and would love to know more about, how was growing up.
I had a pretty privileged childhood, two very happy parents who were, bound to each other in a mission to survive what ended up being a kind of annual move around the entire central swath of the US. So my dad was a sales manager at General Mills. That's a food company. The way that they led things was each annual review kind of came around. If you'd done a good job, you got moved on to the next city. So we were sort of professional new people. And my mother did this incredible work of creating home with lightning speed, and with that really crafting community. And I think it gave my brother and I the skill sets to realize that you could come into any context, be yourself, but also kind of adapt in part, kind of chameleon just enough, in order to find your people and your tribe and make yourself part of a community again and again. Now, fast forward, I would say one key fact is that both my brother and I have chosen to stay in one place for the entirety of our career and switch jobs rather than actually switch places. So I'm not sure what that tells you. But, I was a very ambitious student. I was a traveling mathlete, a trumpet player and drum major. So very, very cool. And really had a pretty grand passion to do something that I thought was important, which at the time led me to become an architect. I wanted to help define kind of lasting dimensions of culture and community through the way that we would shape the built fabric.
And I actually also have Steven, who's our Chief Creative Officer. And he was very interested in learning more about how did you get into architecture or design.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stephen, feel free to
Yeah,
ask.
just for a little bit more context, I too studied for 7.5 years doing architecture, 2 degrees, right? It's a long
Yeah.
one. And I loved studying it. It was so awesome, so broad ranging.
Yeah.
But the reality of it was soul destroying. So yeah, it sounds like you went on a similar journey.
I was going to say, Stephen, we're very bound in our experience. I loved architectural education. I still do. I think it's one of the most expansive, creative meets analytical ways to help the mind think. And it has this long history that helps you, kind of unpack that in detail over time, as well as like audacious ambitions about what the world could be. So the education, amazing.
Mm-hmm.
The practice, particularly in the US, I might steal your words of soul destroying, just very, I think very combative in the sense that as something that is increasingly seen as marginally valuable, like has entrenched itself with more and more defenses and protections, which actually reinforces the systemic decline towards less relevance. And I had always thought I would be an architecture professor who would, have a small practice on the side, kind of a very common archetype. And I had this crisis of conscience where I was like, I can't in good faith go teach people to be a profession that I don't actually believe in. Like it felt like like an ethical forsaking. And so, there I was 10 years into practicing and learning and realizing that it wasn't the path that I actually wanted to pursue.
Yeah, and I know designers who get mad when their work gets killed after a few months of working on it. But architects, I've seen them work for 10 years on something and then it gets killed.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely a different time frame, isn't it? For
totally. Now, I will say this: I have the greatest of respect for architects and like a deep and abiding love for architecture. And I think that the trade-off of that 10 years, wait is that some end up getting to see that they've created lasting edifices that, have the potential to be perpetual.
Absolutely.
Which, as much as I love digital and its speed, I think we can all say that you fast forward 100 years, whatever incarnation of your app is no longer in existence. So it's a different type of imprint.
Mm-hmm.
And so after your career as an architect, I believe that, you started working at IDEO, which is a design and innovation company. Would love to know what was your work there and, what were like a couple of learnings, from that tenure.
Yeah, that was sort of the next decade of my life. And I always describe the start of that chapter as like getting reoxygenated. It was like a bellows was blowing into my soul and refilling this sense of purpose and outcome that I had originally had fueled through architecture education. I came into IDEO, kind of as a lightweight architect. They were building a practice called Smart Space that was really about taking a design thinking methodology and applying it towards a new way of practicing space design. And so the fact that I could, 3D model and talk good talk and had enough, of both the sort of social skills as well as the actual deep technical skills was my, entry ticket in the door. I very quickly morphed and sort of became a more broad service designer, systems designer, and more or less stumbled into my first project in financial services. It was a project in Japan that got sold to me as luxury retail and actually ended up being sort of a profound, like true digital products and, regulatory rethink. And I fell in love. I fell in love with the complexity. I fell in love with the human potential of usually kind of very poorly designed financial services, and spent the vast majority of my remaining like 7.5 years there establishing a practice focused on how we can design for money and use human insight to better shape products and services.
And how were you able to pivot your career, right? From architecture to financial services design? It's kind of like a big change. And a lot of people actually try to bring a change and they are not able to do it.
Yeah. I think a few things I would say, like what are generalizable lessons from that time period. One, I learned the power of self-advocacy, meaning that I could see the connectivity between what my skills were as an architect, down to the strategic written word, where it was opaque to others, right? They knew how to fit me into a particular slot, given a set of superficial understanding of capabilities. I hope most people carry a more expansive portfolio of what it is that they can and could do. And what I learned is that if I raised that flag and I helped paint the narrative, there was usually high willingness to, experiment just a little. And so that pivot was more of like this type of turn, some of it recognizable in rear view mirror versus entirely intentional. The other is that there's a lot of generalizable skills, I think, from any professional background. And we do recognize that for skills like an MBA or a JD. I think architecture fits that type of professional idiom. We tend to force it then into a very tight sleeve, but it teaches you to think at multiple scales simultaneously. It's actually deeply a collaborative function that knows how to navigate a technical environment while maintaining an aesthetic conceptual idea. It knows how to unfold very complicated work across a timeline. And many of those things translate directly into any other kind of making practice.
And I remember that when we were chatting, you brought up that, your transition from IDEO into Intuit, right?
Yeah.
And so when I started YML in 2009, I started YML by using the desktop product of Intuit, which, which was like, it seems like 1,000 years ago or something. And, I remember like, because we started on the basis of like how design and engineering, like in 2009, how it was becoming a big force together. Because before iPhone, the trend was all about like writing great software and application, and people kind of ignored the goodness of design and what it can do to change a product trajectory. And we were so heavily into design engineering, and then in the night I would use QuickBooks, and it was definitely looked very different. But then I remember all of a sudden, after like, I think right around 2015, 16 timeframe, the whole design of every product started changing into it in a big way, like where you can't even identify what I used in 2009 is the same product from the same company in 2015 or 16, right? So what happened back then?
There are some great reflective articles that I think the headline that most people like remember, at least at Intuit, is "Why isn't Intuit dead?" Which asks the question for a technology company that came of age in the late 80s, like, what is it that allows it not just to be tethered to an archaic business model, an archaic set of products and services? And I think that the answer to that is design thinking. And it's the particular brand of deeply analytical design thinking, meaning human insight, experimentation, willingness to disrupt yourself, that Scott Cook really helped put, Scott Cook being the founder of Intuit, helped put into practice. And then Brad Smith, the longtime CEO, prior to the current CEO, Sasan Goodarzi, made institutionally normed. And it really is like a company willing to say, like, okay, we make a ton of money off of our box software products, and we have incredibly loyal customers in a very high friction zone, meaning like churn, non-existent. But that's not where the future is. Like, we will never be able to untap the potential of data without being in the cloud. We'll never actually be able to scale down to the needs of the little guy if we don't embrace mobile. And so we're willing to create the very mechanisms to disrupt our own top of the seed in order to lean into what we know will be future potential and would eventually kill us, right? It's sort of it's the opposite of what did Kodak do or not do.
So it sounds to me like there was some catalyst for the design culture of Intuit to just change. And what do you know what that, can you identify what that might have been?
There's a rigorous pathway at Intuit of looking at the external environment and in tandem with customer research. And so design there has both a little d and a big D. And I would say that the persistence, the through line that wasn't so much a change, but a continuation is the continued practice of little d design, meaning understanding a customer's needs and putting that into a framework of experimentation and improvement that manifests in the product and service. And so that product that Ashish was using had a lot of little d design wrapped up in it. It might not have had beauty, but it did fundamentally have an understanding of customer need that helped expedite kind of a better than moment around like it's faster than, more effective than alternatives. I think that rigor requires, however, that you stay highly abreast of emerging alternatives. And that what, I think the phenomenon you're pointing out, Ashish, which is where the world woke up to the fact that friction-free, intuitive use, mobile norms porting into every aspect of our life, that world was happening around Intuit. And so they chose very intentionally to get on that bus and become a leader versus become increasingly irrelevant as customer norms and preferences changed.
Yeah. And I also remember, Leslie, we actually worked with Credit Karma on their first product. And now Credit Karma is a part of Intuit. Yep. And I just feel like it's such a massive growth engine, and what they have built. And I feel Intuit is in a great position how they can combine all these signals with, the base they have.
Totally. No, I'm although I'm no longer a formal part of that organization, I'm a huge cheerleader and think that they've already done quite a bit in order to democratize financial services, financial insight and outcomes, but like that actually what sits ahead is that much more.
So now coming back to where you are right now as the chief design officer and the chief product officer at Headspace, and you joined Headspace right in the middle of the pandemic.
Yep.
What was the reason for it?
Yeah, I mean, I had one of those moments that I would guess many of your listeners have had over the last 2 years, which is I stepped out of the social momentum of work, right? And, came to sit here in this room staring at myself every day on the screen. And what I realized was that the work that I felt I could contribute to the problem set that Intuit was tackling was largely checkmarked, that my own growth had reached a place where I wasn't like being challenged in a repeated basis to kind of question my own assumptions and develop new subject matter expertise. And what I had to contribute as a product thinker, as a designer, felt largely done. And so with that in hand, I started to turn my eyes towards problems that felt that much more pressing, and where that combination of technology as an unlock and design as a method to, increase positive outcomes, increase engagement, had a right to play. And that focused my attention on a couple of categories. Mental health being, a wicked problem that had the positive of having a light shined on it throughout the pandemic, but the negative being a increasingly catastrophic level of mental health crisis and a dearth of services to meet those needs. I looked at education innovation, for lack of a better term, I looked at ways that technology could actually help improve democracy rather than destroy it. And as I looked at that canvas, it just became increasingly clear that where I wanted to focus my attentions for a next chapter really sat in the mental health space.
And I feel like mental health is also a genre which has gone through massive transformation, right? Like totally. getting a therapist 2-3 years ago was kind of a taboo a little bit, right? And now it's so much more accepted because like what we have gone through. And why you think that is?
Yeah, I think it is being destigmatized by the day, right? But I would hardly say job done. And we certainly see that, depending on your cultural background, depending on where you're at, both in this country and internationally, significant stigma still sits around, treating mentally ill health, as well as engaging in practices that, can help you more from a preventive perspective. So incredible progress, but still quite a road to hoe. I would say that there are a few things. One, it's one of those like slow drip momentums where you see in pop culture, particularly with athletes, an increasing willingness to step out and declare mental health needs as something critical. I mean, you can almost point towards someone new who has come to the foreground and shared their own story. I think that is an incredible means of driving public awareness. COVID did act both as a mirror and an amplifier. And so, what was already a pretty stark mental health crisis, I think the stats were around 30% of all US adults had some level of clinical mental health need, most of it untreated. The accelerant, which has been COVID, and the accelerant that it's had for our youth and adolescents has made the topic unavoidable. And so it's no longer controversial to make claims that mental health is health. I think that has become an increasing norm. You have the US Attorney General issuing, statements and decrees helping to drive policy that is going to propel access to mental health services forward. There's a constellation of things coming together to make things more possible and better.
Something I thought was really interesting, you just mentioned how at Intuit you felt like your work there was having less and less impact, checking boxes almost. But it's also a field that, financial services that has just such poor design. You'd think there'd be a lot there for you to do. But
I think there's a lot more for design to do. I think that I personally felt like my contributions to the space, I had given what I could to propel change forward with a lot of pride around areas that we've been able to bring to the fore, but that I needed to go kind of challenge myself on new topics and areas where I could have, outsized impact.
Yeah, but then coming to Headspace from an outsider's perspective, it's always been such a polished product and a great brand. But it seems like you're more excited about the opportunity to have a greater impact there. So I'm imagining you're using design to solve a much higher meaning problem.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I chose to come to Headspace, incredible brand, right? And just a very strong history of commitment to high quality creative and science, to really putting the systems in place to ensure that the outcomes that we claim around stress reduction, around increased compassion, increased happiness, that they are actually there and relevant. So very, very solid foundation. But part of the COVID acceleration that we've been talking about is that we were seeing with customers or potential customers that they were coming in with higher level of need, clinical need from an anxiety and depression standpoint, that our self-help services were inadequate to fully support. And so there was this very obvious human need that was coming to us directly from members. It was also coming at us from the enterprises with whom we work, who were saying, hey, I've got you guys who have a 30 to 50% adoption rate, and I have this huge tranche of employees with increasingly complex mental health needs. Help me connect the dots and use your service as a front door to access care. And so a big part of my coming in was to say, how do we take what is an incredibly strong foundation and extend it into a broader spectrum of services that can, accommodate higher level in higher acuity need.
So what I love about this, what you're touching on now, you mentioned happiness, in your role as a chief product officer, chief design officer, what are you measuring there? How are you measuring happiness as it pertains to your customers? Do you have customer experience metrics? Do you mind digging into those a little?
Yeah, sure. When it comes, I'll speak about it in a couple of different ways. When it comes to our customer experience metrics around happiness, we do use NPS, like many folks do, and have orchestrated a way to have that survey pop up that gives us a bead across, folks who have just discovered us for the first time, all the way through to those who are, lifelong meditation practitioners. And we aim to understand what the nuance is across those various cohorts. We are gifted to have a very high NPS. We hover around 70, which for those familiar with the scale means like we have a lot more supporters than we do detractors. But we're also looking at other proxies, because what that happiness and the kind of scientific underpinnings of it are really based on healthy habit formation, meaning that you do have a repetitive use and practice of the services in order to actually glean the health outcomes. And so, we're looking at weekly active use, daily active use, engagement numbers, really trying to understand barriers, because we have a little bit of the phenomenon where you sign up aspirationally, but it's hard from going from someone who has ambiguous understanding of the benefits of a practice to someone who actually has developed a new habit. And so on my team, I have behavioral scientists who focus very much on habit formation and how we can build some of the mechanics and understanding of that into the core product itself.
So you don't quite have a happiness index.
We don't have a formal happiness index. The happiness measures, and I don't want to speak out of turn on the specifics of the science, but that particular stat comes from one of our peer-reviewed studies, and adheres to one of the core psychological surveys that are around happiness outcomes and measures. But it's a great idea. It's been discussed before, so we'll see if we end up with one.
I was just curious, and you mentioned habit forming. Obviously, with meditation in general, that the habit of doing it repeatedly is when you start to get the maximum benefit from it. So, what levers do you use to encourage kind of habit forming among people?
Yeah, a few. One is to explicitly state your goal, and for us to be able to help assess kind of where on a change journey you actually are. Are you in a define and commit? Then we can help put a program and course of action in place that's more structured and is proven to drive kind of better outcomes after 14 days, 30 days. We have a few different archetypes. But you may actually be more in a learning mode where you're not entirely sure what it is that your goal is yet. And so providing the type of lightweight content, we have a series called The Wake Up that really provides more expert education than it does per se help you establish yet a meditation practice. The constellation of topics like sleep content, becoming kind of more familiar with a lighter weight, kind of easier entree mode of mindfulness and meditation that then we have good reason and have seen helps lead to an acceptance of trying, more serious meditation on for size. But we also use notification, badging, a lot of the mechanics of bringing you back in and understanding how human behavior needs some nudges in order to continue on a path that you yourself have declared you'd like to be on.
And do you have any sort of more qualitative success stories, anecdotes? We had one instance where we made a financial services app for First Republic, and we got a letter from someone saying they were blind, which 60% sight enabled is considered, well, less than 60% is considered blind. And she said it was the first time she'd been able to use a financial services app, and she was thrilled. So that for me, that's sometimes the best impact you can have.
I couldn't agree more. We get a lot of that. I think being in the space of helping people lower their stress, lower their anxiety, sleep better. It isn't an overstatement to say that folks reach out and share life-changing stories with us. I mean, one that really resonated with me right after I started at Headspace, an old friend of mine from high school who had been in the military and suffered with PTSD, reached out. I hadn't talked to him in 15 years. just to share how much he had benefited from Headspace. And I think he described it as he has like a little Andy in his brain that clicks on, and he can sort of like hear that voice going, and it just even sort of activating that voice and that mental model helps bring anxiety and stress down. And that you know, he talked in very specific terms, some too personal to share in this story, but you know, for me to know that like, oh my gosh, like I'm now having stories that come directly from my own cohort and community of profound difference and change, it just put like a fine mark on how important this work is.
That is so amazing. That gave me goosebumps to hear that story. Thank you for sharing it.
And Leslie, like when, you know, it's true with any good habit forming activity, right? Whether it's exercise, eating nice, eating well, or you know, meditation. After a while, right? Like a lot of times people drop off at some point, right? I mean, I'll give you my example. Last year, started working out, you know, from May until December, 4 times a week, consistent, saw the result, you know, was even more committed, like hence, you know, continued into the new year. But then like after a vacation and like few other life events happen, and like then I've kind of switched to something else, but not really exercise. And how do you make sure that consumers, you know, stay on that path, you know, especially when they're like,
I mean, I'll be honest with you, Ashish, we don't. I think that you just described human beings, right? Like we go through, there's very few things, maybe brushing teeth might be like the one where you're like, okay, I've had like a very consistent habit over life without like essentially any exceptions. What we're trying to do is one, give you a set of tools that you can have at your disposal, whether you're deeply engaged in a practice and coming in and meditating with us 4 or 5 times a week, or if you are very lightly engaged, meaning maybe we've just taught you some restorative breath work. And so you now aren't opening up the app, but you're having a moment of like ramped stress, and you know how to kind of put yourself back into your body and breathe. Success. Now you find that you have an increased need, a parent is sick, there's an external stressor that's actually now ramping back up your need. What we have found is that we have a very large boomerang population in terms of resubscribers. And what people tell us is like, I like knowing that you're a resource that I can call upon again when need spikes. Now over time, you know, we'd love to have lifelong customers forever, and we do have some. But we also want to acknowledge that, you know, mental health is a lifelong journey, and you're gonna ebb and flow. And the more that we can put, you know, an increasing set of tools in your toolkit and then be part of your arsenal, the better.
Yeah. And what about like doing certain kind of experiments, right? As you are pivoting or forming the roadmap of the product, what are the kind of experiments you do so that, you know, you're well informed, like consumers, they're looking for this and not that?
Yeah, I mean, we combine both qualitative and quantitative research, meaning that in the qualitative space, especially, we're doing a lot of, you know, long form, both member and non-member interviewing to really ensure that we're understanding need. And that's across a system of stakeholders, right? Because we also increasingly work with care providers. We have clinicians and coaches within our own arsenal who have deep insight both to the clinical needs as well as to what they're hearing from, you know, folks who are within their care. We also combine that then with quantitative studies, both behavioral quantitative studies as well as live testing, you know, in a true agile workplace form. Some of the things I'm most excited about right now are experiments that we've been doing around evolving assessment. So, you know, at the core of what we do comes the importance of knowing that you actually drove positive outcomes. Like, did you deliver an actual health benefit to this particular individual? And so we're right now doing a number of experiments, some around heart rate variability and making sure that we have quantitative measures to couple with consumption behaviors. as well as looking at a partner that we work with, Ellipsis Health, who drives voice analysis, both NLP and sentiment analysis coupled with voice print, meaning like how do you actually sound in order to run a sub-diagnostic, but an assessment level of your stress and anxiety. And we see huge potential in that to be able to run in the background a bead on how you, Ashish, are doing, just based on this conversation you've had on Zoom, and then be able to dish up proactively the right sets of services and content to help you.
Wow. I didn't realize that, voice can have a lot of signals in it, stress signals.
A lot of stress signals. And, as soon as you think about it, it's actually something that, like, I'd say humans and dogs are fantastic at picking up those stress signals in each other. Yeah. And it, from a human services standpoint, like our care providers, they're well attuned to those things, but they don't necessarily have that fine grain of a quantitative scale to put on it. And so, courtesy of AI and ML and massive data sets, we're able to start parsing those archetypes and signals directly into clinically proven assessment pathways.
I'd even go so far as to say it's not just your voice, but it's even your written voice in tools like Slack or social media. And with us always glued to a screen working remote, we've even discussed having an AI that can tell us when we're stressed at work and maybe we should go for a walk. Do you know what I mean? Just a simple moment to reflect that will take the pressure out of your conversation on Slack with someone, for example.
Yeah. Taking a break is a very important tool.
It really is. It's just a couple of minutes, Sometimes I find you think you're adding value by being always on, but there's a point where it becomes negative value, where you just need to check out for a moment and sort of collect your thoughts again.
Totally.
Yeah. And switching gears to your team, right? Like, I personally love Headspace. Like, I have followed Headspace since it was launched. And, like your friend who has Andy's voice in his mind, it's exactly the same. Like, I've used Headspace for some time in the middle, and like Andy's voice is such a big part of the brand, right? And so how do you look at like the brand side, where like what are some of the things which are so important? Like, how has Headspace been able to establish such a strong brand?
Yeah. Through incredible, like, kindling and holding it closely and tightly. And I will give huge credit to our chief creative officer, who I have the privilege of having on my team, Caroline Pay. She's been at the helm for the last 3.5 years and is herself just a force of nature. That doesn't, by the way, mean that nothing changes. And so I think that ability to say there's something fragile here that needs to be watched and carefully fostered includes having to evolve it. And so, for instance, the brand voice, it used to be that Headspace equaled Andy up until 2 years ago. And what we realized is, Andy is incredible. His voice is incredible, but his perspective, his wisdom, his authentic Buddhist training and background, like so many things. And so this isn't a critique of him, but we were way too light on representation and diversity of perspective. And so Eve became our first next teacher, introducing not just a voice, but a female teacher into the mix. Dora and Kasanga have joined the team over the course of the last year. Samantha Snowden, who really focuses in on children's mindfulness and meditation. And we have a few more in the hopper to add in, as well as those who are part of our international community, as we've really put a stake in the ground in Germany and in France. And so one, like, how do we include folks who have deep affiliation with the brand's ethos, but broaden the net and broaden the representation? Same thing on the side of actually the like look and feel, the creative ecosystem. We evolved away from deeply anthropomorphic illustrations into a set of relatable but much more universal emblems. The happy, smiling, sunny face that you know today, and much of the illustration patterns. We're now, and have been experimenting with this for the last year, really looking at ways to bring authentic documentary photography to life in tandem with the system. And a lot of that is because we're now dealing in a space that has much more emotional depth to it. And all illustration all the time is inadequate to deal with some of the topics and content that we fundamentally have to. And so, always with this ethos of universality, coming back to hope and aspiration, and then how do we make sure that both the brand personification in the form of the teachers, and then the brand system in the form of all of the things that you both touch and the voice and tone actually represent that.
And you've done an amazing job, you and the team, on that. I think. I mean, the evolution it's hard to evolve something that good, but the evolution has certainly been, it's great. I just love it. I think it's come a long way, and it sounds like you've got bigger plans for it moving forward.
Yeah, the team, it's an incredible team. The brand and creative team is just world-class and very strong, and they continue to push the edge.
Yeah, and I'd love to know on that point, you obviously you acquired Ginger recently. So, how was that factored into that sort of brand evolution, and were there challenges along that road?
Yeah, well, we're still definitely on that journey.
Okay.
So for those who don't know, Headspace and Ginger merged this fall. Ginger is a telecoaching, text-based coaching and teletherapy platform, and really helped bring to life Headspace Health, which is this continuum that goes from mindfulness and kind of preventive mental health all the way through the ability to scale up to clinical treatment. And so one of the wonderful things is that as a suite of services, we are like the missing half of what each other was seeking. As the desired kind of engagement model from both companies was really to be able to have this lifelong relationship with their members, and that there was a kind of missing half of mindfulness on one side and a missing half of clinical services on the other. And so really a fusion that brings together a powerful, unique punch, we believe, that can help address true, human need. From a branding perspective, we're really figuring out how to appropriately lean into the power of the Headspace brand. And the things that we have to negotiate are probably very self-evident, which is how do you make sure that the tone can shift to be serious enough to speak to someone who might be in a very severe state of need? How do you ensure that from a resonance within the healthcare landscape, that this is actually something that is seen as deeply professional? Largely the feedback that we're getting externally is check. And there's pretty deep affinity towards leaning into opening this front door to care. That's the kind of the premise of the Headspace brand, as a means to kind of come in and, in a destigmatized sense, access a suite of services. So expect to see more from us on that soon.
Just curious, do you get any pushback from the professional community around, the psychiatrists, for example, around this kind of automation, digitization of an experience that they think should be more in person and one-to-one? Does that ever?
Well, I mean, we actually, I think it would be incorrect to characterize what we're trying to deliver as automation and kind of removing the human. We're really trying to ensure, and that the entire Ginger platform is human service provided. One is text-based coaching from professional coaches. The other is teletherapy and telepsychiatry, one-on-one from licensed clinicians.
Yeah.
So we're not trying to remove the human. What we're trying to do is augment the human and create the types of technology-driven systems that make that care more affordable and accessible. And so, in that missing middle is a lot of opportunity to take the kind of humdrum and mundane off the table, so that when you do need human services, they're more focused, they're more personalized, they're more tailored and more effective.
I love the idea of democratizing something that was once for the very rich, really, wasn't
Yeah.
it? Hundreds and hundreds of dollars per session, really, and
Yeah.
now anyone can sort of gain access to it.
It's incredibly hard to find, right?
Yeah.
Once someone does recognize that they actually have clinical need, at which the stats are astounding. It's something like the average is 7 years from onset of a problem to actually recognition and seeking.
Wow.
Well, then post that seeking, it's historically been very hard to actually find a practitioner. And so we're trying to like speed up a lot of those cycles to engage with you in a way where it's more anticipatory and we can kind of cut things off before they become critical, and then to make it near just in time to be able to go from recognition of need to actual help.
And how do you build a team, Leslie? Like when you're a small startup, it's a lot easier because what is in founder's mind is kind of in everyone's mind because that person is working with the whole team every day. But when you grow, right, how do you make sure that you're building a very strong design culture?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think ensuring that customer insight underpins everything that you're doing is one of the primary means to ensure that that design culture isn't like design in terms of like a small group of people who have been privileged and dubbed designers, but that there's an ethos of customer-driven care and customer-driven innovation that kind of goes throughout the entire organization. The other thing I would say is I have learned the hard way, because I would say it's not in my nature, that you must embrace operational alignment mechanisms. So things like OKRs, the dimension of like alignment around particular language. We are now at that kind of like next growth curve, like nearing 1,000 employees, where there's no way, even if you're a force of nature with a maverick personality, to have a beaten connection with everybody, particularly in a remote reality. And so figuring out how to be repetitive and aligned as a leadership team, how to demonstrate in multiple ways from verbal to visual what you actually mean is necessary to drive that type of strategic and then executional alignment.
Yeah. And special, I'm assuming you all are remote first today. Is that how
we
you
are with an increasing hybrid reality? I think we just got a note that our offices in San Francisco reopened officially today. And so we're trying to, do best of all worlds, where, the flexibility that's been imparted by remote, which really is more inclusive, is something that we continue to invest in and ensure that employees everywhere, and we will always have employees in all 50 states, and we're increasingly global, is an empowered experience versus an isolated experience, while leaning into the potential of in-person. And, I, for one, have really enjoyed like workshops that I've partaken in. I was down in LA last week where you actually get to see people in the flesh. And I think that there's something there that then makes this unfold more effectively in the aftermath as well.
So how do you balance that, right? Like now you have people everywhere in the country, and probably a lot of companies like us, we have grown so much over the past 2 years that we have a lot more people outside of Bay Area than in Bay Area, and now because people are everywhere, how do you make sure they can see each other and they're not just like every day sitting behind the screen and like in and out, and it's just purely transactional, right? How do you make
I think
sure?
it takes a lot of managerial intention.
Yeah.
Right. And so training up leaders to be that much more equipped to act as facilitative connectors, not just kind of managing a squad. And, we're aware of it. I would hardly say that we're at like A+ levels yet, but right now we're leaning heavily into employee preference, right? Like, and I think we always will have that be like the first row.
Yeah.
But saying like there is a role for in-person to play. And for some people, it's going to be, what's emerging as kind of that 3 days a week in the office. For others, that won't be the right archetype. But we're going to have a cadence, whether it's quarterly or monthly, and it's going to be job dependent, where we come together and form community, hash out strategy, and then empower ourselves to act that much more effectively when we go back to our desks, whether that's in an office or at home.
Yeah. Like one of the things we are embracing right now, and we are also in the middle of like how we can meet more because the risk has gone down significantly.
Yeah.
And one of the thing is that when we come together, we are trying to make the whole day, a full day where you're not just working together, but you're actually having dinner as well.
Yeah.
Right. So that you know each other. And then because you're not meeting everyone every day, it's kind of that day, make full use of it.
Yeah.
So that one of the things I realized is when you're a high growth company, and obviously when you're a high growth company, there are like a lot of moments you're under a lot of pressure. And if you don't have that, personal relationship with your team and people, it's kind of hard to go that extra mile, and hence it's so important.
I think in so many ways, and I do realize we're at time here, but trust and like knowledge of another person are the preconditions to collaborate and to be able to receive feedback. And so I'm not saying that it's impossible to establish digital only, but it's harder.
Yep.
And I am seeing that in-person commingling, kind of social and strategic, are shortcuts to being able to get over those humps of knownness so that you can actually have tough conversations and, get to alignment together more quickly.
Yeah. So we are at the last part of our podcast, Leslie. It's called the sprint. And I'll give you two options. You have to pick one. And there are no right or wrong answers here. Okay. Apple or Google?
I'm Apple.
Bezos or Musk?
Musk.
Netflix or HBO Max?
HBO Max.
Experimentation or research?
Ooh, false dichotomy.
Okay, so from an architectural point of view, San Francisco MoMA or New York MoMA?
New York. Sorry, 80s. That's not my favorite architectural era.
Anything, Steven, you want to add?
Well, it's had the new extension, hasn't it? Was it by Herzog and de Meuron, which is...
I do like the new extension, and I'm nothing against Mario Botha, but I know. Come on.
Very postmodern. I agree. Looks like a licorice stick.
So that was it. This was great.
Well, thank you so much. Enjoyed chatting. I hope there were, a few useful nuggets in there, and just enjoyed the opportunity to discuss some important topics together.
Absolutely.